Good evening, or as we were just saying, possibly good afternoon. And for our guest tonight, it's actually good morning. Not only good morning, but it's very early morning. So thank you so much for Kirk for getting up with crack of dawn to talk to us. I've wanted to write a book on Seminar 14 for a very long time. And over the summer, I discovered Kirk had already done it, which saves me an enormous effort. So I was hugely grateful for that. And then absolutely delighted when I got a chance to read it and discover that it was a much better book than the one I'd written. So I got in touch with Kirk and asked him if he'd come along and talk to Lacan in Scotland. And he very generously agreed. So I'm really looking forward to Kirk's talk tonight. Before we move into that, just to flag that we have a full programme of Lacan in Scotland events for the year now. We'll get that up on the website as soon as we've got a chance to. But just to note particularly next month's talk, which will be on the 28th of November. It's on Thanksgiving Day, so if you're in the States, if you want to escape turkeys, then you can do Lacan in Scotland instead. It will be much more exciting. The talk in November is on David Lynch. The talk is around a book which we get published in about a week's time on Lynch and Freud and Lacan. So looking at Lynch's films through the lens of Freudian and Lacanian theory. And we have one of the contributors and the editors joining us. So it'll be a kind of three-way presentation, looking particularly, I understand, at Mulholland Drive. So sounds like it'll be a really exciting event. But for now, we're going to hand over shortly to Kirk. Before we do that, just very quick housekeeping. The format of tonight will be the same as the format usually is, which is Kirk will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for discussion afterwards. If you have questions, please save your questions till the discussion point and let Kirk have a chance to go through his talk first. Once we get to the discussion, if you do have a question, please use your raise your hand using the raise hand function. So raise your yellow hand on Zoom, and we will identify you and take you in order and try and manage an orderly question and answer session. But we'll come to that shortly. Before we do, Kirk, thank you so much for coming along tonight or this morning.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, my name's Kirk Turner. How you doing? Yeah, good evening, Edinburgh. Hello, everywhere else. Firstly, I'd like to thank Calum and everyone at Lacan in Scotland for inviting me to speak today, as well as Ian Parker, who actually introduced me to the group as well. And thanks to everyone here for zooming in. As mentioned, yeah, it's just past 6 a.m. In Australia, and that's why I'm still in the pajamas here. So yes. Yeah, so some of you may not have read my work yet. As mentioned, I published my first book this year in August, which began as an extension of a PhD on Lacan, completed in February 2020. Things were looking a little different then, and pretty soon after we were asked to stay home for a bit. But there is one thing about being locked down 6 times for a total of 263 days. It gives you a lot of time to do research. So I wrote some new chapters in my book. That's the cover, sorry. Shameless promotion. And got rid of about 1,000 footnotes. But yeah, anyway, please have a read and let me know what you think if you are interested. When asked to talk today, I did briefly consider adapting something directly from the book. However, I've already been through it quite a few times this year, so I was happy to consider something new. And I happened to be watching the TV show Euphoria at the time when Calum first contacted me. So I'll be talking a bit about that, as well as Euphoria as a word or concept in a more psychoanalytic context, and to some extent their relation to fantasy. To frame things a little as well, Come As You Aren't, the title of the talk is, of course, a nod to Nirvana, but it also refers to Freud's discovery, as Lacan defines it, the self's radical eccentricity with respect to itself, which is what Lacan calls the mode of absolute subjectivity. So what I'm sort of looking at is how do fantasy and drug use allow one, to a certain extent at least, to be or come as they are not. And how do these things help us to better understand this conception, Lacan's conception of the self? So these will be kind of guiding questions. I will start with a no spoiler synopsis of Euphoria before moving on to Freud and Lacan on the state of Euphoria. And we'll touch on things such as Freud's cocaine experiments, the religious ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and some recent Lacanian research on addiction, among other things along the way. So if that sounds good, I will continue. All right. So by the time the television network HBO aired the final episode of Game of Thrones in May 2019, there was both widespread dissatisfaction at the concluding season of the series, as well as a search for something else to replace it for the millions of its viewers across the globe. Running since April 2011, and despite several filming delays keeping us in suspense, it was for many a cultural constant and a quick solution to small talk topics around the office water cooler, virtual or otherwise. A month later, in June of 2019, HBO introduced what has since become its second most watched show since 2004, behind only Game of Thrones itself, Euphoria. Second season was postponed due to the pandemic, but was ultimately released in January 2022, so this year. With limited available capacity, the makers were also able to produce 2 self-contained specials in 2020 and 2021, each focusing on one of the lead characters. So just for those who have never seen it or perhaps never even heard of it, the HBO website very sparingly states that Euphoria follows a group of high school students as they navigate love and friendships in a world of drugs, sex, trauma, and social media. And I would emphasize drugs, sex, trauma, social media. It's less Beverly Hills 90210 and more 90210 shit. Did that just happen? The area it's set in, East Highland, is fictional, but from the shooting locations, one can identify Southern California, a mixture of middle class and affluent houses, and dive bars, strip clubs, hospitals, motor inns, liquor stores, drug dens, rehab centers. Other locations are classics for teen shows, the shopping mall, the roller skating rink, the bowling alley, the burger joint, the school auditorium, hallways, and bathrooms. However, almost everything else is not a classic teen show. The narrator and main character, Rue Bennett, seen here in the slides, is a 17-year-old high school student who is constantly oscillating between relapse and recovery from drug addiction. We see her life in raw detail, along with the tribulations of her friends, lovers, and school peers, all characters connected through familial, institutional, or drug culture ties. Not only praised for its storyline, cinematography, music, and performances, it has led to fashion and makeup trends, the most Twitter activity on a single topic in the current decade, and a number of controversies, usually related to sexuality, such as showing around 30 penises on screen within a number of minutes in a single episode. There's also a Lacan link, funnily enough, tenuous, but it's a link. Among the cast, there's someone who read Lacan's work on holiday in another HBO television series, The White Lotus, the actress Sydney Sweeney, who you can see on the right here in the slides. That's a selection in her hands in the photo. As most of us know, the complete edition would be a little harder to hold on to on holiday. It's a bit heavy. Yes, and here is her character Cassie in Euphoria, looking a bit different there. Cassie's quite often shown in various states of undress in the show, so much so that Sweeney and other cast members have asked if they could perhaps keep their clothing on more often in future seasons. So there's an undeniable voyeuristic quality to parts of the program, which can actually bring up problematic ambivalence for the viewer as follows. If we're expected to sustain our disbelief, as with other dramatic series or films, and get taken away in the intentionally dreamlike, druggy flow of each scene with the low-lit visuals and evocative soundtrack, we are also basically observing 17-year-olds as they do drugs, fight, and have sex. The actors are definitely older than the characters they portray, as they almost always are. And the writer-director Sam Levinson has said that the show is not targeted towards teens. It should instead portray a generation who have grown up online to those who did not. Not that teens are not watching it, of course. This has led to some criticism of the show as being, for instance, quote, excessive fantasy, or quote, fantasy revision of high school for millennials. Even current high school students, not the target audience as we recall, have taken to social media to ask if other high schools are actually like this, because theirs certainly isn't. This applies to things like costumes, as seen mocked here on TikTok. And here we have one from Twitter as well. However, I would argue that despite this over-the-top, quote, fantasy high school character, or in fact because of it, it reveals aspects of phantasmatic structure in a psychoanalytic sense, namely how the image is put into play in a scenario, how the subject relates to the object, and the many bleak contrasts to the glamour, fun, highs, orgasms, i.e. the overdoses, beatings, shootings, kidnappings, bullying, cutting, sexual assault, can be legitimately confronting. They do arguably touch on something of the real of trauma. Each episode even comes with warnings and a list of resources for those actually affected by these issues. To its credit, Euphoria also avoids easy answers or moralizing. It is less stay off drugs and more, this is what can happen when drugs become a constant part of someone's life. Most of the drug users shown are not spiraling out of control, in fact. Indeed, we are provided with intentionally unclear motives, a patchwork of possible pathways, as the characters themselves are trying to work everything out. As one of the characters in season 2, Elliot, notes to his friend, the lead character, Rue, I feel like everyone's looking for like a cause and effect. Sometimes shit's just like, is what it is. For example, it is tempting to expect that the lead character Rue's drug addiction stemmed from a significant death in the family, often alluded to and shown in flashback. However, she confides to Elliot in the same scene mentioned that she would still probably be doing drugs anyway. It was an encounter with addictive pain medication at the start of her teenage years, which led to other and increasingly more substances. An early series of encounters with mental health professionals has only had the effect of complicating things for her, and she lists off mockingly her various diagnoses. So on the one hand, she's trying to find a reason, as she puts it, for everything, for some meaningful explanation, as others have told her this is the only way of letting go of the problems of her past. But at the same time, she mocks her Narcotics Anonymous meetings, even turning up high at times, or intentionally alienates those trying to help her. And the second season especially makes drawing conclusions difficult, as it inserts postmodern pastiche of other shows and films, using metafiction, intertextuality, the unreliable nadir, even a 2-episode play within a play about the childhoods of the characters, which foregrounds its status as fiction. As good Lacanians, however, this of course leads us to question the status of truth. Fictitious does not mean illusory or deceptive as such, as Lacan notes in Seminar 7. Instead, he says, it is within this opposition between fiction and reality that is to be found the rocking motion of Freudian experience. Watched among the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021, Euphoria could function as a compensatory stand-in for some things that were no longer going on. Or for millennials, according to some in the media, things that weren't happening anymore anyway. Racy parties, random hookups, hangs, and escapades. Yet it wasn't necessarily something to binge like Game of Thrones et al. Either. Little time between episodes to process everything can be a good thing. For instance, after watching season 1, episode 7, which is called The Trials and Tribulations of Trying to Pee While Depressed, and the pain arising from a shutdown bladder during a manic episode is the excruciating focus. I need a little time afterwards. And like some series which reel you in with a few provocative episodes before becoming generic, The second season of Euphoria was in no respect toned down. It starts off with a bang, or literally two bangs, as a strip club manager is interrupted while receiving fellatio via gunshots to the thighs, the sheer violence of which completes Julie with the sight of his still erect penis and the justified screams of his distraught companion. We are introduced to the gun-toting grandmother of one of the central characters, whose occupation as shop-owning drug dealer was left unexamined in the first season, a Tarantino-style origin story. And the third season has been green-lit, so it will be interesting to see if the current tone is sustained or if some sort of arc, some form of arc is introduced. What I mean is we don't really learn what is beyond high school or actually anything else for these teens, except in one episode in the form of a Little House on the Prairie fantasy shared between a drug dealer and his high school girlfriend of living on a farm with 3 children in their 30s. And in terms of ruse addiction, the lead character, especially, if one stays on the path of recovery, what comes next? What happens to all of the excessive, substitute, supplementary, or indeed surplus enjoyment when one is forced to sacrifice it? And in terms of viewership, do the people want a success story or a train wreck? From a Lacanian standpoint, and whether you like the show or not, Euphoria does raise at least one significant issue. What is the addict searching for when they are willing to destroy anything, friendships, relationships, even themselves, in an attempt to encounter and re-encounter the chosen object of desire within a temporary euphoric state, which, when over, sets them back one step again in reaching any fullness of enjoyment? To answer this, I will now look at how the state of euphoria is referred to in a psychoanalytic context. So how do Lacan and Freud discuss euphoria? Something I wasn't sure about either before writing this for you all. So this is a bit of new material here. How is euphoria different from terms such as ecstasy, pleasure, and of course, jouissance, which have semantic and qualitative similarities? The French word l'euphorie, in fact, only occurs twice in the nearly 900 pages of Lacan's Écrit, merely once, which is in the Rome Discourse among the 600 plus pages of the other Écrit. And we have to wait until 1958 to hear it mentioned in the seminars, yet here it also stops. So let's look at these references briefly before commenting. So in both Aggressiveness in Psychoanalysis and A Theoretical Introduction to the Functions of Psychoanalysis in Criminology, which are collected in Écrit, Lacan refers to some of the negative effects flowing from pseudo-Darwinist theories circulating in the 19th century. The first of these is economic euphoria in the Victorian era, which he says sanctioned for that society the social devastation it initiated on a planetary scale. And secondly, the euphoria of the dominant class when hearing the criminological theories of César Lombroso, who employed a biological atavistic separation of degenerate criminals from quote unquote ordinary humans, which the dominant class needed, Lacan states, for both their intellectual comfort and guilty conscience. In the Rome Discourse, which is collected among the other Écrits and served as an introduction to his well-known function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis, Lacan notes, with reference to his own experience of finally being applauded, approved of, responded to enthusiastically, in this particular case due to the liberating effects of his proposal on the power accorded to language, that the euphoria of that feeling should die down with the accompanying applause, and that in fact, approval can inspire in him a greater reserve. Thus, in each of these uses, we see a kind of false inflation of exuberance based on theoretical knowledge, which is fleeting and misleading, and even just used to justify such things as the conquering of space and individuals. And most of us know well from reading the seminars that Lacan constantly tried to avoid easy understandings or neat applications of his theories. So these examples show a kind of distrust of intellectual euphoria. What about in the clinic for Lacan? So in seminar 5, Formations of the Unconscious, the one reference to Euphoria made on June 18, 1958, comes from a case of female obsessional neurosis involving the coming to consciousness of penis envy, which was published in 1950 by Maurice Beauvais in the French Psychoanalytic Review. This analysan's particularity is in fact so intriguing for Lacan that the article is discussed from June 11 to the final session on July 2. So 4 sessions all up he spends on this one article. The case in question concerns the topic of identification. And as Lacan summarizes the subject's history, a 50-year-old Catholic paramedic and mother of 2 comes to consultation due to common obsessive phenomena: fear of having contracted syphilis, obsessions of infanticide or poisoning, and religious blasphemies involving insults and scatological phrases. Alarmingly, instead of the consecrated bread, also known as church wafer, she imagines male genitalia. In place of the host, says Lacan, she represents to herself in her imagination the masculine genital organs, without there being any question of hallucinatory phenomena. It is significant, Lacan continues, that her mother, with whom she had a conflict, alone was responsible for her Catholic education, and that on the spiritual plane, we witness a return of the repressed in this substitution made to the body of Christ, i.e. the word made flesh. Christ is then identified by Lacan with the other as locus of speech. And this extends to wanting to step on the penises of crucifixes with her heel, and a subsequent inability to buy shoes, which is actually brought on by the treatment. Yet Lacan is also adamant that there is something beyond all of this, which is not to be sought in any kind of history involving the mother. So Lacan disagrees with Beauvais' assessment of the case study early on, noting, quotes, "The direction of the treatment rests upon the interpretation that it's about a desire for phallic possession and correlatively a desire for the castration of the analyst. On closer inspection, this is far from representing what is effectively present in the observation." And this is where fantasy comes to play a role in this case, at least. Fantasy, as Lacan says in this seminar, is what helps one find one's bearings and situates their desire. It attaches the latter to an object, one which is not natural, but formed by a particular position the subject takes in relation to the other. The drive relates to this desire to the extent that speech isolates it, fragments it, and places it in a problematic and disjointed relationship to its aim, Lacan says, which is known as the direction of the tendency, the object of which is subject to substitution or displacement, and thus also subject to all forms of transformation and equivalence. In the case of the obsessional in the study is discussing, we find the unbinding, Entbindung, of the drives, and it is the aspect of destruction which can be isolated, Lacan notes. What does this mean? It means that the other's desire, which is again the access point to desire for all subjects, is initially destroyed and annulled by the obsessional. The closer one gets to obsessional desire, the more it blinks, wavers, and disappears, he comments. And being as it commonly is first the desire of arrival, the subject reacts with destruction. And if they approach the desire, it disappears. For the paramedic obsessional, an intolerable rivalry comes in the form of the mother's desire attached to a far-off love that distanced her from both her husband and her child, which, Lacan notes, involves the phallus at the level of the signifier of the other as barred. There is thus always desire kept at a distance. And what if a spouse or partner brings in their desire to the relationship with the obsessional, he asks? The obsessional spends their time destroying the other's desire through a muted attack or permanent erosion, which tends to culminate in the abolition, devaluation, and disparagement in the other of what is their own desire, he says. This is due to a specific relation to the demand in childhood, one which helps them come to terms with their desire, he explains. The demand is articulated in a verbal form of destruction, of undoing what has been done, of isolation and defense. So with the female obsessional under discussion, Lacan notes that her blasphemy has the effect of diminishing the object of faith, the Heavenly Father. The other becomes an object thereby and is destroyed. This presents a problem as the analysand feels like a victim of the obsessions and forms a sense of guilt. How does one then stop the demand and bring about the phrasing of unconscious discourse? That desire beyond demand in analysis, then, Lacan questions. Again, the phallus as signifier of the other's desire is what is at stake for him. That being conscious of penis envy is crucial in the analysis of a female obsessional neurosis goes without saying, Lacan argues here. For never to have encountered the phallus in an analysis of obsessional neurosis, or any other kind of neurosis, female or not, would be really quite odd. Nevertheless, Bouvet's approach, he says, is one which consists in satisfying demand in a sort of imaginary mirage by granting the obsessional an object through the symbolization of an imaginary fantasy by the analyst. And here we return to the concept of euphoria, as this is the state in which the treatment ends, at least in the article. So Lacan comments, the very termination of the case by euphoric identification, intoxicating for the subject, the description of which completely matches a masculine ideal located in the analyst, perhaps brings a change in the subject's equilibrium, but this is surely not a genuine response to the obsessional's question. So why is it not a genuine response? It is because the obsessional has the demand for death as its horizon, he says, which is equated with the death of demand itself. However, the analyst in this case, Bouvet, has made the obsessional love their obsessions in a certain way, he says, inasmuch as they are invested with the full signification of what happens to her, thus removing her guilt and creating a form of narcissistic effusion. Thus, to quote Lacan one more time, the result is brought about by an intervention essentially centered on the fabric of her fantasies and their value as fantasies of rivalry with man. Rivalry is supposed to transpose some kind of aggressiveness towards the mother, the roots of which are never touched. So to complicate this to add to this complex picture even further, we will look at Freud now. So in his Gesammelte Werke, complete works, Euphorie appears only 4 times, not counting a use by Breuer in studies on hysteria concerning Anna O. These are in regard to Freud's once teacher, Theodor Meinert's theories on the origin of hypnotic euphoria, twice in jokes in their relation to the unconscious, and a comment on the increase in motor strength during cocaine euphoria, something Freud had himself scientifically tested in the 1880s. So in 1884, in addition to measuring the power of his arm, Freud tested the psychical effects of cocaine by taking doses of 0.05 to 0.1 grams and in recording his impressions, commenting that the feeling consists of exhilaration and lasting euphoria, which does not differ in any way from the normal euphoria of a healthy person. In Freud's experience, in terms of well-being, this amount did not have a stimulating effect, but instead got rid of any depressive traits. This may remind one of Thomas de Quincey's English opium eating confessions, where he says, it was not for the purpose of creating pleasure, but of mitigating pain in the severest degree that I first began to use opium as an article of daily diet. So thus Freud concluded, one may perhaps assume that the euphoria resulting from good health is also nothing more than the normal condition of a well-nourished cerebral cortex, which is not conscious of the organs of the body to which it belongs. Freud was thus able to distinguish, as he explained to the Vienna Psychiatric Society a year later, the relation between the effect of cocaine and the euphoria elicited by cocaine, with the caveat that only few experience, like him, a, quote, pure euphoria without alteration, unlike alcohol, which changes one's state of mind. Thus, he says, there's an absence of science that could distinguish this state arising from cocaine use from the normal euphoria of good health, despite the increase in endurance and the ability to ignore rest, food, and sleep. Now, to counter this view, one researcher critical of Freud's somewhat positive description of cocaine at the time, Louis Lewin, noted that, as with morphine, the cocaine user is nearly always aroused too late from this delightful state of euphoria and somnolence to painful reality. Now, obviously, Freud's method is not the same as that of Jack Nicholson's character, Frank Costello, in The Departed, when he throws a handful of coke onto a bed and tells an escort, "Don't move till you're numb." And Freud even admits that other researchers, in what was a very early stage of study, it must be added, did have different experiences. And we know from history that some well-respected scientists at the time did in fact become addicted to cocaine. Freud was also looking into its scientific applications, particularly for use in ophthalmology, and was not out to discover a new recreational pastime for himself. Nevertheless, and moving on a decade, in his letters to colleague Wilhelm Fliess, particularly 1896 to 1900, euphoria is discussed mainly in a medical or a creative sense, as a heightened state of feeling and alertness in a patient in his final days, a condition lasting a few months before the outbreak of tumors, a sensation responsible for a verse of writing before a significant date, and the productive thrill involved in intellectual work, in this latter case, Freud's. Now, Freud may have tended towards a position somewhat skeptical of euphoria, at least this stage, as the translator Masson informs us in their letters that his colleague Fliess believed mysteriously that euphoria was a sign of impending disaster. Now, in Fliess's own work, he spoke from personal experience in describing mental work that is carried out easily as a sign of his oncoming periodical migraines. This changes slightly in his own works. For example, the text on jerks from 1905. Freud here comments on the toxic mood of cheerfulness, which is characteristic of uncontrollable laughter when almost anything or everything is funny. And he says this is a state of euphoria achieved by the psyche, which is not its regular disposition. Later in the same text, he clarifies that we attempt to regain through jokes, the comic, and in humor, the mood of our childhood, where the psyche had a lot less work to do. So why is this so? Because the adult psyche works with three forms of economy, he explains: inhibition, ideation, and feeling. These regulate pleasure in the subject, and in childhood, we were very happy to do without them. Freud developed these considerations in 1907 in reply to a letter from Jung. Writing to Freud, Jung described how in a case of incestuous longing of a sister toward her brother, guilty feelings which led to suicide attempts were suddenly abated and switched to indifference and euphoria once the reality of her brother's engagement to another woman had hit her when told by their mutual sister about his wedding gifts. She seems, Freud comments, to have succeeded in disengaging her libido from her brother and substituted this with the indifference and euphoria. He began to account for this theoretically as a consequence of the reinforcement of the ego by withdrawal of object investment. And finally, with respect to Freud, by the time we reach the new introductory lectures in 1933, we also encounter a related theorization of euphoria, which is manic this time, in the context of the structural theory of the ego. Within the realm of melancholic attacks, where the usually overly harsh superego applies strict morals and punishes and humiliates the ego, Freud describes contrary cases wherein the ego finds itself in a blissful state of intoxication. It celebrates a triumph, as though the superego had lost all its strength or had melted into the ego. And this liberated manic ego permits itself a truly uninhibited satisfaction of all its appetites. So how can we summarize this? We see a shift in the object. Sorry. We see a shift in the objects, a concentration on the ego, a removal of inhibition, imposed or otherwise, and a form of childlike enjoyment again. Is the latter something the addict seeks behind, as it were, the object itself, involved in the fantasy of complete jouissance or satisfaction? what it looks for beyond the pleasure principle. Jouissance should not be seen as the however brief euphoria itself, but that which arises along with the compulsion to repeat. It is pleasure-seeking behavior indeed, but behavior which thrives on excess. Why does one need to efface the self in order to achieve this? To alter the mind, be someone they are not? Deep down, as Lacan says, the neurotic is nameless. In one significant scene of Euphoria, the TV show now again, in the violent carelessness of relapse, the addict Rue uses the limit of death as a bargaining chip. If she is prevented from getting high, she tells anyone in her way, she will kill herself. As an addict, she uses this as a strategy to make enablers cave in. And as Lacan informs us, this is also one of the child's earliest forms of fantasy, i.e. putting their own life and death into play via the familial or protective other. As Lacan explained to his audience at the Catholic University of Louvain on October 13, 1972, you're right to believe you will die, it sustains you. Thus, he says, it is akin to faith. He then asks the audience, if you didn't believe it, could you bear the life you have? If we couldn't rely on the certainty that it will end, how could you bear all this, he asks. So addiction is somewhat a playing with death against the risks of overdose, infection, criminal punishment, isolation, organ failure, the breaking down of the body, but also, on the other side, a means of bearing life. And in their anthology on addiction, Lacanian practitioners Karine Malone and Yale Goldman Baldwin hence argue that substance abuse represents a subjective choice and is thus a significant form of human suffering, as well as a subjective responsibility. Now, euphoros in ancient Greek had meant to carry, bearing well, to bear or endure with ease, power of enduring easily, contentment, to be fertile, productivity, abundant produce. Later Latinized, it evolved through new scholarly uses in the 17th and 18th centuries to reflect a sense of well-being in disease, feeling healthy and comfortable despite sickness, or the effective operation of medicine. When we get to the 19th century, we get the adjective euphoric, something characterized by euphoria, or later a drug which causes euphoria. Now, this shift came about in part with reference to cocaine, which was isolated as an alkaloid in 1855, so just before Freud's birth. Today, when we use the word, it can be somewhat a mixture of intense happiness and elation, along with a drug-like state, which is evoked. In addition to narcotics, jokes, and identification involving fantasy, which we've looked at, euphoria can be achieved by way of music, sex, exercise, fasting, or mystical and religious experience. If it is said to not, quote, reflect the reality of one's situation, this is the American Psychological Association's definition, it may be associated with bipolar hypomania or mania. And the term gender euphoria, which means elation at transitioning from one's assigned gender, is also one of the new linguistic uses which needs to be considered. So Christina Lorita, a Lacanian analyst whose research is focused on addiction, emphasizes the importance of the drive in particular in cases of addiction, linked to repetition compulsion and jouissance, that enjoyment beyond the pleasure principle. So some of the things we've already been looking at. She reminds us in her reading of Lacan Seminar 11 that the jouissance of the drive is attributable to its circling around an object beyond which is a semblant of emptiness. Specifically, she notes that a transformation on the level of the drive is necessary to address addiction in the clinic, thus requiring that the real be impacted through the symbolic. In addition, and crucially, what Lacan called the moorings of being have to be modified. Many approaches to addiction recovery miss the specificity of the subject and have one-size-fits-all steps and measures. Against this, the course of one's history and suffering must change by way of touching on the subject's relation to the signifier, she argues, and thus shifts needs to be created within cycles of repetition. So in 1966, Lacan had commented that his projects, his return to Freud, emerged from a question that Freud had given new meaning to, in beyond the pleasure principle? How is reality established, namely to the satisfaction of the pleasure principle? But by means of this questioning, which forced open the ambiguous relations between reality and pleasure, Freud had opened a traditional barrier related to jouissance, Lacan says, which would lead Lacan himself beyond the reality principle, so de-emphasizing homeostatic regulation and instead outlining the unstuck character of the subject and its enjoyment. It is pleasure itself, as Lacan argues, that sets limits to jouissance and not the law. Jouissance is only possible between the lines, and pleasure is what binds incoherent life together. Now, in fantasy, as Lacan maintains, desire is a defense against going beyond a limit in jouissance. Hence, it is always a relation of the barred subject to the object, which can never, however, achieve the imaginary fullness of a complete coupling. Now, by ingesting, the addict can try temporarily to become one with an object, of course, until the substance is broken down into toxins expelled and the whole dance begins from the start again. But what of those who have said to have achieved coupling with the object without the use of narcotics? Can the religious ecstasy of mystics such as Saint Teresa be put on par with the hedonism of the addict? If the subject's phantasmatic support is instated to avoid such excess, what can be said of religious euphoric states? As Lacan tells us, there are some who get the idea or sense that there must be a jouissance that is beyond. Those are the ones we call mystics. Now, on March 27, 1963, during Seminar 10, Lacan first mentions Saint Teresa of Avila in the context of the object of desire, i.e. of fantasy. This is one of a number of important qualifications in regard to the differentiation and sexuation of fantasy. That is to say, could those in the position of the female, or any non-phallic position, have a different relation to the object, and indeed a different object? For the woman, he says, it is what initially she doesn't have that constitutes the object of her desire at the start, whereas for the man, it is what he is not, and that's where he falters. In Saint Teresa's case, the relationship with small object A, so the subject's relation to the object, is solved in a privileged and typical way, he says, which is not invented, but ready-made. Now, just a bit of background. Born in 1515 in Avila, Castile in Spain, Teresa of Jesus had lived from around the age of 21 in convents and experienced various forms of religious ecstasy throughout her life. In Seminar 20, ecstasy is brought into discussions of ex-isting, i.e. involving ekstase, being or standing outside of oneself. In this case, what is known as mystical transverberation. Teresa herself defines ecstasy variously in her writings as union, rapture, elevation, flight of the spirit, and transport. In ecstasy come great true revelations, great favors and visions, she says, all of which help to humble and strengthen the soul, to make it despise the things of this life, and more clearly realize the greatness of the reward that the Lord reserves for those who serve him. She thus felt that God had given her the grace of ecstasy, and she heard the words, I want you to converse now, not with men, but with angels. As she writes in the account of her life, the soul makes no effort to feel the pain caused by the Lord's presence, but is pierced to the depths of its entrails, or sometimes to the heart by an arrow, so that it does not know what is wrong or what it desires. It knows quite well that it desires God, and that the arrow seems to have been tipped with some poison, which makes it so hate itself out of love of the Lord that it is willing to give up its life for him. It is impossible to describe or explain the way in which God wounds the soul, or the very great pain he inflicts on it, so that it hardly knows what it is doing. But this is so sweet a pain that no delight in the whole world can be more pleasing. The soul, as I have said, would be glad always to be dying of this ill. Now we see here in the next slide, Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculpture, St. Maria della Vittoria in Rome, the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which I assume Milea chose for the cover of Seminar 20, even though it's only mentioned once, incidentally, she's only mentioned once, sorry, in the entire seminar. But as we see here, Teresa with the golden spear of arrow of fire plunged into her heart, and her experiencing ecstasy in the presence of a cherub here. Now, describing this encounter, this particular one in her writings, which caused her to moan several times, she says, she recounted, "This is not a physical, but a spiritual pain, though the body has some share in it, even a considerable share." She notes a difficulty, therefore, in ecstasy. How is it when the faculties of the mind are suspended? How is it that one can understand things that have never come into its mind before? The vision side of divine presence is forgotten, she says, and yet an imprint remains such that the soul is no longer itself. It is always intoxicated. Now, Lacan calls her a tough fucker in this seminar, in the translation at least, due ostensibly to her monastic life and also travels on foot across Spain, but also this pain which she succumbs to, but also withstands. So in seminar 20, it's almost exactly 10 years after his first reference to St. Teresa in seminar 10. So February 20, 1973, during seminar 20, Lacan brings up St. Teresa when discussing another female Christian mystic, this time from the 13th century, the Beguine Hadewig of Antwerp, who had mystical visions of what she described as heavenly love. And she's left us with some amazing descriptions of these, along with poetry, prose, and letters, which are actually collected in one volume and quite interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, in seminar 20, Lacan notes that Hadewig, in her ecstasy, like Teresa, is coming. In the French version, jouit, that she enjoys. So it's a bit of an ambivalent word there. So what is she getting off on, he questions. Now he explains that mystics experience ecstasy, but as Teresa says, know nothing about it. Therefore, this jouissance is extra, en plus, Lacan says. And he comments, doesn't this jouissance one experiences and yet knows nothing about put us on the path of existence? So again, the self's eccentricity with respect to itself. And he continues, why not interpret one face of the other, the God face, as based on feminine jouissance? So the mystic's unio mystica, or mystical union, is able to attain a dimension where there is a desire for a good at one remove. Lacan says, a good, namely, that is not caused by little a. Thus, a good that is beyond the fantasy objects of the infinite, which he calls a spiritual marriage. Now, in a rare discussion of drugs in 1975, Lacan notes that man too enters a unique form of marriage. Man is married to his prick. He is afflicted by it, he comments here. Thus, everything that allows us to escape from this marriage is obviously welcome, hence the success of drugs, he comments. Now, he follows this up with a definition of drugs, which he admits is somewhat jovial, as he comments directly after, let's return to serious matters. Anyway, he says drugs are what allows the marriage to this little wee-wee to be broken. Now, as the academic Thomas Sowell points out in his discussion of these remarks, with Freud, addictions are a means of maintaining a relationship with the phallus, i.e. in a masturbatory sense, without the connection to the other, a short circuit to jouissance. For Lacan, however, addictions are a way of obtaining jouissance, but instead of obtaining this through the phallus, he speaks of attaining it by breaking a connection with the phallus. Now, this is a new approach. Swallows notes, as addiction in an early psychoanalytic model was seen to short circuit the path to satisfaction, taking the subject out of the social bond in a mode of direct satisfaction akin to masturbation. Now, Freud had early speculated that masturbation is a primary addiction behind addictions to alcohol, for example, morphine, tobacco, or in Dostoevsky's case, gambling. Yet he would soon after discuss addiction in relation to sexuality more broadly. Narcotics are meant to serve, Freud says, directly or indirectly as a substitute for a lack of sexual satisfaction. He writes in 1898. For the late Lacan, however, Swallows continues in his comments on the passage from Lacan on drugs. Addiction correlates with an escape from the phallus in a different sense, namely addiction as a jouissance correlated with an escape from what Lacan calls the affliction of the speaking being with sexuality itself. Now, to return to Euphoria very quickly, we see here a world where the other is transparently lacking. We have divorced parents, criminal parents, adults who will sell you into sexual slavery, the failure of schools to regulate violence or bullying. There's no hope or no future, ostensibly. But it also shows us a world in which the sexual relationship is impossible. There are no long-lasting relationships. It's a world of hookups, dramatic breakups, etc. So it's within this context that Rue, as Lacanian analyst Anna De Filippi notes, Rue actually acutely separates herself from the social order and her own speaking body through her drug use. Yet this has the effect of pushing her towards a debilitating identification with the real, she comments. So just coming to a close now. Yes, so we've talked about in the obsession or the addict, the mystic in uncontrollable laughter, in fantasy, in euphoria, these different forms of bearing life, which we've called them, drawing on the original meaning of euphoria, or with respect to its limits, and also what Larita called the semblant of emptiness beyond the object. Now, each of these forms of bearing a life allows us to come, in Kurt Cobain's words this time, doused in mud, soaked in bleach, as I want you to be. But I would add that it doesn't come with any comfortable identity of what we are. Euphoria and fantasy, as we've seen, take one aside from what they are to come as they aren't, to have what we do not have, to be what was not to be. The question is, do they take one away from or eventually closer to the realization of fundamental lack in the self and the other? And that's the question I will end with. And thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kirk. We will shortly open things up for questions, but I'm going to kick off greedily with a question of my own. Excuse me while I try and formulate this into something comprehensible. So my question relates initially to the TV show Euphoria and the use of the title Euphoria as the title for that TV show, but it's something that plays really well through your analysis there of Freud and Lacan and their references to euphoria and the connection there from euphoria to addiction and the relationship there between euphoria and drug use, which is kind of a pretty commonplace connection. But the way you make that connection, I think, really is what brings me to this question, or brings out this question. There seems to be in a lot of our thinking, and I'm thinking here, you make the reference to DSM, that kind of DSM reference to euphoria and to addiction, and the DSM much more generally operates on the basis of an assumption of an achievable, or for most people, achieved norm. So, we need the DSM because some people deviate from that norm. And that norm then becomes normalizing in both a statistical sense, but also in a moral sense. That's, the DSM, although it's a supposedly medical handbook, is actually in many ways a moral handbook. And I wonder, I mean, I try to articulate my question for you. In your analysis, your reading of Freud and Lacan, do they entirely escape that moralizing implication in their discussion of substances that, you know, alter a relationship with jouissance, alter a relationship with the world around us, you know, what we would commonly refer to as drugs? It seems to me that the term euphoria in the TV show is, and this is something that occurred to me before you talk, but it kind of links, I think, to what you were saying. I've not actually seen the whole of the TV show, but I've watched clips of it, and it struck me that the term euphoria is used in a, or might be understood to be used in a rather ironic way, in the sense that none of the characters actually seem that happy, and euphoria seems to carry that sense of, well, you went through the etymology. So originally, this idea of being born well, but even in its later usage, it has that sense of a drug-induced well-being. But none of the characters in the TV show seem to have, you know, despite the quantity of drugs that they take, it doesn't seem to induce any well-being at all. Quite the opposite. It just seems to induce more and more misery. So it occurred to me that the title is rather ironic there, and that irony itself draws attention to the moralizing perspective that we would tend to take, that this refusal of reality into this drug-induced euphoric state is somehow a moral failing, that the moral thing to do would be to accept reality in its lack of jouissance, in its mundanity, in its painfulness. And my question, I guess, really is, to what extent are Freud and Lacan able to escape that moralizing themselves? We might expect them to, particularly Lacan, but it seems to me from your reading that they don't quite escape that assumption that there is a real, in the non-Lacanian sense, there's a reality that drugs take us away from, and there is somehow a normalizing, moralizing judgment to be made in terms of that shift away.
Thank you. Yeah, I think especially starting with Freud, I think especially because it's such an early stage when he's starting off his scientific career with what we now refer to as drugs, kind of as a commonplace term, that people are actually using drugs apart from alcohol, and gradually morphine. Cocaine kind of became the third recreational drug in that sense at the time. But this idea of the habitual drug user was a much more limited form, I'd say, and especially in his understanding. Of course, one of his co-analysts, Gross, was a famous addict who committed suicide. That Freud had a lot of guilt around his relationship with him. But still, at this time, especially in the pre-psychoanalytic days, it's a very early stage of drug use, particularly in society. And now that we're seeing epidemics of drug use and certain drugs that have been normalized, I think this whole context, which we currently understand, has to be firstly outlined in Freud's time as being completely different. But yes, it's definitely that moral sense that he comments almost derisively that some people get addicted to these substances, but not him. So there's certainly a moral approach in that sense. As we get to Lacan, I don't think it's as present. Obviously, as Follis, as I mentioned, has said, there aren't that many references to drugs in Lacan's work, or directly, or to addiction itself. So that's particularly why I looked at some of the current Lacanian research on the topic, just to get more of a broader perspective on that, because they're often quoting isolated statements that aren't really very well formed in terms of a theory of drugs or anything, but also drawing on his other comments to kind of round these out with their current clinical cases. And obviously now, as drug use is a big ubiquitous, you of course have many people coming to the clinic that are afflicted by drug use, but may not be their main symptom or the thing they're trying to overcome. And what was interesting in the case of Lorita's research is that she said she doesn't expect her analyzans to necessarily quit drugs before they come on. To her, the treatment itself, the reason for being there, is the number one priority. And if that involves them taking drugs while they're seeing her, that's, well, it's not fine, but I think she draws the line at them taking drugs directly before the session. But she's trying to get at this kind of emptiness behind drug use, or whatever's behind drug use for the individual, and also emphasizes this specificity, singularity, particularity of each person. And to return to Euphoria, I think, yeah, as I mentioned, there's not this moralizing tone. You get the sense that almost all the characters abuse drugs in some form or the other. Almost all of them are seen abusing alcohol. What is particularly interesting is the role of opiates in the show, as the state of euphoria is incredibly fleeting, and as particularly the main character Rue's addicted to opiates, it's more about just taking it to not feel like she's going to die, basically. So she's always talking about this anxiety about her fading away, or if she stops thinking, she'll die. And so with the opiate use is particularly interesting because she's just trying to get anything just to get her through to the next stage. But you don't really see her enjoying it. And mostly when she is on drugs in the show, she's just kind of faded away. So yeah, definitely, as you mentioned, euphoria is somewhat of an ironic term in the show. And there's definitely more traumatic moments than there are positive ones. We do see some people take Molly, ecstasy, things like that at parties, and there are some nice visuals of them enjoying the drugs and having a good time. But these are definitely in the minority. But yes, as mentioned, the show itself doesn't really take a moral tone. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see which direction they take it in, because in the scenes where Rue's trying to recover from drugs, she kind of has this flattening of effect, and she doesn't really know what she should feel anymore. So she's been on pills for at least 4 years, and she's experienced kind of the gradual numbing of her senses, etc. So it'll be interesting to see if she does recover, how she handles this, what is there to replace all this, instead of just this constant quick fix, going back to the beginning and starting again, and until it gets unbearable, and then starting trying to find the next fix, which leads her down many very dark paths. If people have seen the show, or if not, might see it. But yeah, Euphoria, yeah, especially as I mentioned with Lacan, most of the references are more towards intellectual euphoria, kind of this false sense of inflation, and particularly, yeah, any euphoria in his analyzans at the end of treatment. I think he discusses more of a flattening or a subjective destitution as the goal of the end of analysis. One, I think he mentioned in seminar 7, in the case of training analysts, that they should basically, at the end of their analysis, reach an understanding of what their own death means, the removal of themselves as signifier in the signifying chain. and then starting from that point, that kind of emptied out point. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's a really fruitful response to the questions. Really helpful. I just want to, so I'm being rather greedy here, but before I open things up to the audience, the kind of second point I wanted to get to is that use of euphoria in relation to gender reassignments, which you referred to. I'd never heard that that coinage before, that idea of gender euphoria, and that struck me as really interesting in that context of, and you use the term yourself there when you talk about Lacan, that euphoria as a false sense of self. And I wonder if that's that use of euphoria in relation to gender as a choice itself kind of needs to, or how that relates to that moralizing position that we have a real self and a false self, or a true self and a false self.
Yeah, that's yeah, I was hoping someone would bring that up, because yeah, when I was looking at the different linguistic uses of euphoria, that one struck me as being a slightly new meaning to euphoria. And yeah, I think we have to be particularly careful, because we, of course, have to be accepting that people achieve different forms of happiness or satisfaction in transitioning to a gender which they choose and not are assigned to. So I think that should be put in the forefront, first of all. But having said that, also, perhaps I think the term gender euphoria arose due to the original use of dysphoria as a state where they were particular individuals were not comfortable with their assigned gender. So it's been kind of used as an antonym to gender dysphoria, not necessarily in the sense of euphoria, everything's great, exuberance. So yeah,
Dysphobia.
Sorry?
It's almost a dysphobia rather than a euphoria.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I definitely avoid saying that this has got any kind of false false exuberation or anything like that. But yeah, it's an interesting use of the term there, that they've chosen that to describe that experience. And obviously, I can't comment on it directly, obviously, but if one feels that they've been assigned the wrong gender and is able to alleviate that situation in some way, then there must be some form of euphoria involved, definitely. But yes, as you mentioned, this sense of the self, is that the true self, etc. I think yes, in the psychoanalytic context, that's something probably we'd avoid emphasizing too strongly, that there's this true self, that the final goal has finally been attained, etc. So, but yeah, it's interesting that that linguistic usage brings up these issues.
Okay, I'm going to open things up to other people, Kirk. I don't want to dominate things. Great, Thomas, please go for it.
Yeah, thanks. Awesome talk, Kirk. I thought of so many analysans, but two in particular, and all kinds of thoughts stimulated by your talk. So I'm trying to narrow things down, literally narrow things down to a question. The two patients that I have in mind are a man and a woman, each with a kind of cross-gender identification, if you will. She is has a kind of classic sort of phallic identification, is very active, very competitive. He, however, has conversely a very strong female identification, despite being attracted to women, aroused by women, compelled to occupy a woman's position in a kind of identification with a deceased mother. Now, to get to my question, each of them in the sort of darker or deeper regions of their anxieties and fantasies comes the notion of a needle, of penetration, problematic penetration. So I guess my question is something around the idea of the phallus as an instrument of death, as a, in terms of the drug euphoria, the syringe, the poisoned instrument, bringing death with its pleasure. So I guess the question is, have you come across that, this idea of the phallus as needle, as some dehumanized object operating in euphoria?
Good question. So in most of the senses that I used phallus, particularly in the talk, were more focused on its role as signifier, as trying to instating the function of meaning and things like this. So I hadn't directly thought about more bodily considerations such as that. And also, yeah, in the TV show, we don't really see that often the needle used. Although there was one significant scene where a drug dealer has taken the lead character kind of hostage, and she's trying to get her hooked on morphine to try and turn her into a sex slave, as I mentioned very briefly. So that's kind of one of the bleakest moments in the entire show, and this kind of going against her will, but as a last resort, as she's crying for a fix of anything, this penetration with the syringe, and that's one of the most haunting images, I think. Just the what level addiction makes one succumb to. In the context of that euphoria, that's the only example I can think of. Most of the other ones are the most substances are in pill form that they're taking. Marijuana is kind of seen as not counting at all. I think they call it California sober, drinking beer and marijuana. That's kind of just commonplace now, particularly as it's legalized. And I think it kind of reflects kind of the drugs of choice. At the moment, these more easily consumable with hip names, different types of pills, etc. So no, that's an interesting point. Yeah, when I was trying to piece all these little, obviously my talk was composed of different eras and different topics all around this one overarching theme. But I think, definitely this aspect of death kept coming back at me, and made me actually return to Seminar 7 to look at it a lot, which I didn't have time to add, unfortunately. But this limit of death, the between two deaths that Lacan also talks about in the seminar, and also that the addicts, they haven't completely given up on life. It's not like just a suicidal drive to nothingness, and they haven't given up on everyone else in their lives. They still need them to a certain extent, which I think is illustrated in the show quite well. That obviously she's 17, so she hasn't got much hope of leaving the family, but she's always in this weird relationship, strange relationship with the family, that she always kind of tries to get rid of them, but also needs to hold on to them. It's the same with friends. But you see, how the drug takes over. The drug's the best friend. The drug's that significant, most significant other for her, and which totally reshifts every time she's also in the recovery phase. And you see this sort of transition away from that object and gradually reinvesting into things like family and any notion of a future. That's what I'm most interested in seeing, this idea of the future, and if there's anything for her in terms of bearing life, not just waiting until she dies, what can she fill in the gaps with there? That's what I'll be interested to see. So yeah, no, that's what you said sounded fascinating.
Thanks, Thomas. It's interesting that connection between what you're just saying there about the TV show, but also drugs more generally, and death, that kind of complex relationship between drugs and death, in the sense that there is in a Lacanian sense, a second death prior to death achieved through drugs, or death drive achieved through drugs, but also a kind of a movement towards a limit that the drugs literally take you to death, can always, depends on the drugs, but run that risk of taking you to that point of death as well. So it was a flirtation, a dance with death, which is kind of interesting point. It kind of reminded you, when you were talking there, of a passage from Rick Luce's book on addiction, where he relates a story of someone admonishing some drinkers in an Irish pub about how their drinking is slowly killing them, and they say, that's okay, we're not in a hurry.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yeah, just that limit of death, because with the increase of the dosage as well, that the addict has to gradually, to get any form of euphoria, has to gradually increase this dosage, and to such an extent that some addicts can take doses of what would normally kill someone who's never taken it before, and just this gradual the response of the body to building up this tolerance as well, and them having to increase in the knowledge that a little too much could actually tip them over the edge. I think that's quite interesting as well.
And presumably often does.
Yeah.
Interesting. I've also, I know Thomas has gone off mic now, but very interested in this idea of the needle. I know you're saying in the TV show that it's not intravenous drugs that they're really focused on, but I find that really fascinating, that idea of the needle as phallus, and I'm not quite sure where that's that analogy goes, and how far we can push that. It's an interesting idea. The needle is the salvation in some ways, to inject this bringer of euphoria to the drug user, but also potentially the bringer of death as well. And I guess the flip side of that as well, people who are trypanophobic as well, what does that say if the needle is the phallus? Is that a fear of castration, or it's an interesting one?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, especially in the early references to fantasy, this kind of penetration of the body or devouring of the body, fantasies like that, also seen as a source of anxiety and fear for the subject. So the needle itself is definitely both penetrates the skin, hurts a little. Not everyone's favorite part of the drug trip, I guess, in that, of the intravenous drug trip, but is what brings the euphoria ultimately. So that this kind of necessary evil. Sorry, that was it.
Yeah, no, interesting. So, do we have any more questions from the audience? Where Kirk and I are devolving into a one-on-one chat here and excluding everyone else. Yes, we have Soo-young Kim.
Hello from South Korea.
Hi.
We have time. Can I ask you a brief question, or can I share my thoughts with you?
Yes, please. Yes, very much. Please do.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, and I'm really happy to take part in this discussion. I loved the last part in particular, where you talked about euphoria being the relationship with the fellas in case of Freud, whereas it's breaking away from that connection, that relation with the fellas in case of Lacan. And then I thought maybe Freud was afraid of moving on to the serious cases of addiction because he was afraid of needles, because it was really traumatic. It must have been a very traumatic object, since he had this traumatic experience with what happened to Fleischl and the death of Fleischl. So it seemed he was resisting moving on to the cases of addiction in Freud's complete edition. Then maybe he was, everything he talked about, all the cases he talked about are within the realm of the symbolic. And thus, maybe if Freud wanted to, or if Freud was more courageous or courageous enough, then he probably would have moved on to the realm of the real and really talked about the cases of addiction. So I think this, everything Freud said is what happens before we move on to the proper Lacanian real. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's interesting that I mentioned Larita's research on the real of the body. Yeah, the substance basically not only changes the mind, but one's relation to the body. Diets change, sexual appetite, etc. Everything about the body that under quote unquote normal conditions changes with the drug use and gradually diminishes the functions of the body. In the show, this is represented, for example, that the lead character gradually becomes more mute as well, is less able to explain anything that's going on with her. It's just when she tries to speak, she can't, etc. She's very much trapped at the level of the body. So yeah, definitely brings in the real aspects. Yeah, and the penetration of the needle, particularly at the level of the real. So yeah, I think that's interesting that's the way the current Lacanian clinic on addiction is kind of focused on this aspect, and yeah, trying to verbalize that process to change things, and not necessarily just saying stop the drug use, and trying to get at why drugs are necessary. The problem is also that the person using them can't actually, oftentimes can't control the amount that they're having. So it's more of a necessity and not a personal choice. Even though you see many addicts start to say that they've got it under control, etc. Or even with alcohol addiction, similarly, it's literally something out of control. It becomes taken over by the body. So yeah, this is definitely interesting that it's definitely a development of Freud's work, which is, yeah, as I mentioned, historically at a very early stage of these things. And yeah, as with many things that Freud brings up, it's certainly novelties at the time, things others perhaps weren't even talking about and writing about, in him grappling with these things. But a lot of useful indications that Lacan's picked up on, and we can still draw on. Yeah, and I think in terms of the phallic society as well, or the patriarchal society, I think this in the show particularly, this is something, the scene that's broken down. And for example, Miller has in recent years talked about the end of the age of the father, and that we have to look beyond this kind of heteronormative patriarchal society. And something the show does well, one of the lead characters is actually a transgender actor, and something the show does well is kind of show a snapshot of people at this particular age and what the future societies, or at least Western societies, could look like, and some of the new kind of people that are going to come to the clinic and their particular upbringings, where there's not these stable senses of strong religion or this strong family structure. So I think, yeah, that's another reason another sense of the phallic, non-phallic enjoyments that I also think is brought up by the show. But yeah, thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Stu and Kim. It's 9:40 here in UK time, so kind of slightly over our time. Not that that's an issue, but I'm going to bring things to a close here and say a massive thank you to Kirk for a really fascinating, generous talk. When I invited you on the show, I was kind of expecting you to talk about the book, and I'm so pleased that you gave us much more than that. You took us beyond the book. You've opened up a really interesting corner of Freudian Lacanian thinking that certainly I've not explored very much. Really amazing food for thoughts. And also you brought a TV show to be that I don't know, and now I need to go and watch, which I'm also very grateful for. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As I said at the outset, November's session, we will be joined by Olga Cox-Cameron and the editors of this new book on Freud, Lacan and Lynch, which I've not had an opportunity to read yet, but I understand it's a fantastic book. Having looked at the table of contents, it looks a really brilliant collection. So please join us in November. Take care of yourselves in the meantime, and hopefully see you in Wonder shortly. Thank you. Goodbye.